The storm hit Copper Ridge like the wrath of God himself, thunder cracking across the desert sky as lightning illuminated a lone figure huddled in the ruins of what had once been the town's finest stable. Clara Whitmore pressed her back against the rotting wood, water seeping through gaps in the roof above, each drop a cold reminder of how far she had fallen. Just 6 months ago, she had been the school teacher, respected and cherished by the townsfolk. Now she was nothing more than a ghost haunting the edges of civilization, branded with shame and driven out by whispers that cut deeper than any blade. But on this rain-soaked night in September of 1887, as the wind howled through the abandoned structure, like the voices of all who had condemned her, Clara Whitmore was about to discover that sometimes salvation arrives not with fanfare or explanation, but in the quiet actions of a stranger who asks for nothing in return. The stable had been her sanctuary for 3 months now, ever since the good people of Copper Ridge had made it clear that a woman who bore a child out of wedlock had no place among them. Never mind that she had been deceived by a traveling merchant who promised marriage and disappeared with the dawn. Never mind that she had lost the baby before it ever drew breath, her body racked with grief and fever for weeks afterward. The town had made its judgment, and Clara had learned that mercy was a luxury small communities rarely afforded. She pulled her tattered shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the familiar ache in her chest where hope used to live. The stable provided shelter from the elements, but not from the loneliness that gnawed at her soul like a persistent wound. During the day, she foraged for berries and wild vegetables, sometimes finding discarded scraps behind the general store that the owner, Tom Bradley, would leave deliberately where she might find them. He never spoke to her, couldn't risk his reputation, but his small kindnesses reminded her that not all humanity had been stripped from this harsh place. The thunder rolled again, closer this time, and Clara closed her eyes as memories washed over her like the rain seeping through the roof. She remembered her classroom, filled with the eager faces of children hungry for knowledge. She remembered reading to them from books about far-off places, their eyes wide with wonder as she painted pictures with words of cities where gaslight pushed back the darkness and trains carried people to new destinies. Now those same children crossed the street when they saw her, their mothers pulling them close as if her very presence might contaminate their innocence. A flash of lightning split the sky, and in that brief moment of illumination, Clara saw him. The figure sat motionless atop a black horse just outside the stable's entrance, water streaming from the brim of his hat like a curtain. For a heartbeat, Clara's breath caught in her throat. Was this some specter conjured by her desperate mind, or one of the men from town come to drive her even further into the wilderness? But then the horse shifted, snorting and shaking its mane, and she knew this was no phantom. The man dismounted with fluid grace despite the storm, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Clara shrank deeper into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the 3 months since her exile, no one had ventured to the abandoned stable, and certainly not in weather like this. She watched as he led his horse into the shelter, the animal's hooves echoing against the old wooden floor. He was tall and lean, his dark coat soaked through, but he moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to hardship. Without so much as glancing in her direction, though she was certain he must know she was there, he began to work. From his saddlebags, he produced a small axe, its blade catching the intermittent lightning that flickered through the doorway. Clara wanted to speak, to demand an explanation for his presence, but something in his bearing warned her to remain silent. There was no threat in his movements, no aggression, but there was an intensity that spoke of purpose beyond her understanding. She watched, transfixed, as he moved to the pile of broken timber that had once been part of the stable's loft, wood that had been too wet or rotted for her to use for kindling. The sound of the axe biting into wood rang out above the storm's fury, each stroke precise and powerful. He worked methodically, splitting the salvageable pieces into manageable sizes, his breath visible in the cold air. Rain continued to pour through the damaged roof, but he seemed oblivious to the water soaking his clothes, focused entirely on his task. For over an hour, he worked in silence while Clara remained hidden in her corner, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. The pile of split wood grew steadily, and slowly, impossibly, she began to feel something she hadn't experienced in months, the warm flutter of hope beginning to kindle in her chest. When the stranger finally finished, he had accumulated enough dry kindling and split wood to last for weeks. Without ceremony, He arranged some of the smaller pieces in the old fire pit that Clara had been unable to use, the wood too wet, and her matches too few and precious to waste on failed attempts. From his coat, he produced a small tin of oil and a handful of dry tinder that he must have kept carefully protected from the rain. The fire caught quickly under his practiced hands, flames dancing up from the kindling to lick at the larger pieces of wood. The sudden warmth and light transformed the stable, pushing back shadows that had seemed permanent fixtures. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as heat began to seep into her bones. The first real warmth she had known since the last of her meager coal had run out weeks ago. The stranger stood slowly, brushing wood chips from his hands, and for a moment Clara thought he might finally acknowledge her presence. Instead, he moved back to his horse, checking the animal's gear with the same methodical care he had shown in preparing the firewood. He unsaddled the horse and rubbed it down with practiced strokes, speaking to it in low murmurs that Clara couldn't quite make out over the crackling of the fire and the steadily diminishing storm. When his tasks were completed, he spread his bedroll on the opposite side of the stable from where Clara huddled, as far from her as the space would allow while still benefiting from the fire's warmth. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair silvered at the temples, and settled down with his back against a support beam. Only then did he speak, his voice carrying easily across the space despite its quiet tone. "Storm should pass by morning," he said, not looking in her direction. "Fire'll keep through the night if you tend it proper." Clara found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Thank you." He nodded once, a barely perceptible movement, and pulled his hat down over his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing had evened into the steady rhythm of sleep, leaving Clara alone with the dancing flames and a confusion of emotions she couldn't begin to untangle. Clara woke to the gentle warmth of embers still glowing in the fire pit, and the soft sound of someone moving about the stable. Pale morning light filtered through the gaps in the walls, and the storm had passed, leaving behind the clean scent of washed earth and the promise of a clear day. For a moment, she lay still, wondering if the previous night had been some elaborate dream born of loneliness and desperation. But the warmth was real, and so was the neat stack of firewood beside the pit. The stranger was already up, tending to his horse with the same quiet efficiency he had shown the night before. In the morning light, Clara could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 40, with weathered features that spoke of long years under the sun and wind. There was something familiar about the set of his shoulders, the way he moved, but she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. As she watched, he filled a small pot with water from a flask and set it over the rekindled fire. From his saddlebags, he produced coffee beans and a small hand grinder, working with practiced movements to prepare what would be the first real coffee Clara had tasted in months. The rich aroma filled the stable, and her stomach clenched with hunger and longing. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 cups, setting one on a flat stone within her reach before retreating to his own side of the fire. Clara stared at the steaming cup as if it were made of gold, hardly daring to believe this simple kindness was real. Her hands shook as she lifted it to her lips, the bitter warmth flooding through her like a benediction. "You don't have to stay hidden over there," the stranger said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority as the night before. "Fire's meant to be shared." Slowly, Clara gathered her courage and moved closer to the fire, settling herself on a piece of log that served as a makeshift seat. In the daylight, she was acutely aware of her appearance, her dress patched and worn, her hair hanging in tangles, her face gaunt from months of inadequate food. But when she glanced at the stranger, she saw no judgment in his eyes, only a patient acceptance that made her throat tight with unshed tears. "I'm Clara," she said, the words feeling strange after so long without proper conversation. "James," he replied, and something in the way he said it made her look at him more closely. There was pain in his voice, old and deep, the kind that came from losses that could never be recovered. They sat in comfortable silence as the morning advanced, sharing the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship of 2 souls who had learned that the world could be harsh beyond measure. When James finally rose to saddle his horse, Clara felt panic flutter in her chest. He was leaving, and she would be alone again with nothing but memories of this brief respite from her isolation. "The wood should last you through the first cold snap," he said, adjusting his horse's bridle. There's more dry timber in the old miller's shed if you know where to look.
What?
Clara asked, the question bursting from her before she could stop it. Why would you help me?
You don't even know me.
James paused in his preparations, his hands stilling on the leather straps. For a long moment, he didn't answer, and Clara thought he might simply mount his horse and ride away without explanation. But then he turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, a grief so profound it seemed to have carved lines into his very soul. I know what it's like to lose everything, he said simply, and I know what it's like to need someone to see you as human.
Oh.
When the world's decided you're not. 3 weeks passed before Clara saw James again. The wood he had cut lasted exactly as long as he had predicted, providing warmth through several cold nights and the cooking fire she needed to prepare the small game she had learned to trap. The knowledge that he might return had sustained her through the difficult days, giving her something to hope for beyond mere survival. When he appeared again, it was just after sunset, his horse picking its way carefully across the uneven ground to the stable. This time, he carried supplies, real food that made Clara's mouth water, blankets that weren't threadbare, and a small bag of coffee beans that represented luxury beyond her wildest dreams. Figured you might be running low, he said by way of explanation, unpacking the supplies with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. As they shared a meal of beans and salt pork cooked over the fire, Clara found herself studying James's face in the flickering light. There were questions she wanted to ask, stories she sensed he carried but didn't share. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for months seemed to recede in his presence, replaced by something she had almost forgotten existed, the simple pleasure of human connection. "You're not from around here," she observed, noting the slight differences in his accent, the way certain words carried echoes of places farther east. "No," he agreed. "Been traveling for a while now. Don't tend to stay anywhere long." "Why not?" James was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her chest ache in sympathy. "Sometimes staying means remembering things you're not ready to face." Clara understood that kind of pain, the way certain places could hold ghosts that followed you through every day and haunted every night. She had felt it herself in town, where every street corner and familiar face had been a reminder of what she had lost, what she could never get back. "What happened to you?" she asked gently. "In town, I mean. What made them turn against you?" Clara had told no one the full truth of her story, not even Tom Bradley, who left her scraps behind the store. But something about James, about the patient way he listened and the absence of judgment in his eyes, made the words come easier than they ever had before. She told him about the traveling merchant, Samuel Pierce, who had swept into Copper Ridge with promises and gifts, courting her with a persistence that had eventually worn down her careful defenses. She spoke of how he had convinced her that they would marry as soon as he returned from his next business trip, how she had believed his promises even as her body began to change with new life. The humiliation of waiting for a man who never returned, the growing whispers as her condition became apparent, the devastating loss of the child that had cost her everything but given her nothing in return. "The worst part," she said, staring into the fire as tears tracked down her cheeks, "wasn't losing the baby, though God knows that nearly killed me. It was watching people I'd known my whole life look at me like I was something dirty, something to be ashamed of. I taught their children. I helped them with their letters when the mail came. But none of that mattered once they decided I was fallen." James listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as her story unfolded. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant call of night birds settling in for sleep. "You deserved better," he said finally, and the simple statement, delivered with such quiet conviction, made Clara's tears flow harder than they had in months. Over the following months, James's visits became regular, arriving every few weeks with supplies and staying for a day or two before continuing on his mysterious travels. Clara began to look forward to these visits with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. She had learned to live without hope, but James's presence rekindled something in her heart that she had thought permanently extinguished. During their long conversations by the fire, she began to piece together fragments of his story. He had been married once, to a woman named Sarah, who had died in childbirth along with their son. The loss had shattered something fundamental in him, driving him from the home they had built together in Kansas. and setting him on a path of constant movement that kept him one step ahead of his grief. I couldn't stay, he explained one evening, as snow began to fall outside the stable. Everything there reminded me of them. Her laugh in the kitchen, his cry that I'd never hear. I thought if I kept moving, maybe the pain would get tired of following me. Has it worked? Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. James's smile was tinged with the kind of sadness that came from hard-won wisdom. Pain's not something you can outrun. Best you can do is learn to carry it without letting it drag you down. As winter deepened, James's visits became longer, sometimes staying for a week at a time. They developed routines that felt almost domestic. Clara would tend the fire and prepare meals, while James maintained the stable and hunted for fresh meat. In the evenings they would sit together sharing stories, dreams, and the comfortable silences of two people who had found unexpected solace in each other's company. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Clara first noticed the way James sometimes touched his chest, a reflexive gesture that seemed to cause him pain. When she asked about it, he dismissed her concerns, claiming it was just an old injury acting up in the cold. But Clara had been a teacher long enough to recognize when someone was keeping secrets, and she began to watch him more carefully. Spring brought new challenges and new possibilities. As the weather warmed, Clara ventured further from the stable, gathering wild herbs and early vegetables that added variety to their meals. James taught her skills he had learned in his travels: how to read weather signs, how to preserve meat for lean times, how to find water in seemingly barren places. In return, Clara shared the knowledge she had accumulated as a teacher, reading to him from the few books she had managed to salvage from her exile. Their relationship deepened beyond mere companionship, though neither spoke of it directly. Clara caught herself watching for the first signs of his approach, her heart lifting at the sound of hoofbeats that might herald his return. James lingered longer with each visit, finding excuses to delay his departures and reasons to return sooner than his usual schedule would suggest. One evening in late spring, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, James reached for Clara's hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, his skin warm and solid against hers, and Clara felt something inside her chest flutter to life, not the desperate hope of her earlier days, but something steadier and more profound. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he said quietly, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "After Sarah died, I figured that part of me was buried with her." Clara turned to face him, seeing her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "I know. I thought I was broken, that whatever capacity I had for love had died with everything else." They kissed as the last light faded from the sky, tentative at first, then with growing passion as months of unspoken longing finally found expression. That night, they made love with the desperate tenderness of two people who had learned not to take happiness for granted, who understood that joy was something to be treasured precisely because it was so fragile. As summer arrived, bringing with it longer days and the promise of abundance, Clara and James were forced to confront the reality of their situation. His visits had become so frequent and prolonged that he was essentially living at the stable, yet neither had spoken of permanence or the future beyond the next shared meal or quiet evening by the fire. The issue came to a head when James returned from a supply run to the distant town of Cedar Falls with news that changed everything. Samuel Pierce, the traveling merchant who had ruined Clara's life, had been arrested for fraud and bigamy in Colorado territory. He had been running the same scheme across multiple towns, promising marriage to vulnerable women, taking what he could get, then disappearing before the consequences caught up with him. "He's been at this for years," James explained, his voice tight with anger. "At least a dozen women that they know of, maybe more. He's going to prison for a long time." Clara felt a strange mixture of vindication and emptiness at this news. For so long her anger at Samuel Pierce had been one of the few emotions strong enough to cut through her despair. Now, knowing that justice had finally caught up with him, she found herself uncertain what to feel. "It doesn't change anything," she said finally. "Not really. The people in Copper Ridge still think I'm a fallen woman. They don't care that he was a criminal. They only care that I let him fool me." James was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression Clara couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that made her heart begin to race. "What if we left?" he said. "Together, I mean. There are places where no one knows our stories, where we could start fresh." The offer hung between them like a promise and a prayer. Clara felt her heart soar with possibility, then crash back to earth as reality reasserted itself. She loved James, that truth had become undeniable, but she also knew that running away together would mean abandoning any hope of reclaiming the life she had lost. "I can't," she whispered, the words feeling like physical pain. "Not yet. This is still my home, James. These people, for all their cruelty, they're still my people. If I run now, I'll never know if things could have been different." James nodded slowly, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "I understand. I do. But Clara, I can't stay here indefinitely. This place, these memories, they're not mine to carry." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Clara's life. James spoke of towns farther west where opportunities were opening up, where his skills as a craftsman and her education could provide them with a good living. Clara talked about her need to face her demons rather than flee from them, her hope that someday the people of Copper Ridge might see past their prejudices to remember the woman she had been before her fall from grace. In the end, they agreed that James would make one more journey, a longer one this time, to scout opportunities in California, while Clara remained at the stable. If she still felt bound to this place when he returned, he would respect her choice, and they would find a way to build a life here. If she was ready to leave, they would go together and never look back. 3 weeks after James's departure, Clara woke to find herself burning with fever and racked with chills that made her teeth chatter uncontrollably. At first she thought it was simply the change of seasons. Autumn was arriving early, and the nights had grown cold without James there to help maintain the fire. But as the days passed and her condition worsened, Clara realized she was dealing with something far more serious. The illness hit her like a physical blow, leaving her weak and disoriented. Food became impossible to keep down, and even the simple act of maintaining the fire became a monumental effort. For the first time since James had appeared in the stable, Clara faced the very real possibility that she might die alone and unmourned, her body not discovered until spring brought travelers through this abandoned part of the territory. In her delirium, she saw faces from her past, her students, her parents who had died when she was barely grown, the baby she had lost before it ever drew breath. Sometimes she imagined James was there, holding her hand and speaking in soothing tones, but when the fever broke momentarily, she always found herself alone. It was during one of these brief periods of clarity that Clara heard hoofbeats approaching the stable. For a moment, her heart leaped with the hope that James had returned early from his journey. But the rider who appeared in the doorway was someone she never expected to see. Tom Bradley, the owner of the general store who had been leaving her scraps for months, stood silhouetted against the afternoon light, his face etched with concern, and something that might have been guilt. "Jesus, Clara," he breathed, taking in her condition with obvious alarm. "When was the last time you ate something?" Clara tried to speak, but could only manage a whisper. "Tom, what are you doing here?" Doc Henderson mentioned seeing smoke coming from this direction for weeks, then nothing for the past few days. "I came to check." He moved to her side, his hand cool against her burning forehead. "You're burning up. How long have you been sick?" The next few hours passed in a blur of activity, as Tom rode back to town and returned with Dr. Henderson and supplies. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness as they worked to bring her fever down and get fluids into her dehydrated body. She heard fragments of conversation, something about pneumonia, about how close she had come to dying, about the irresponsibility of letting her live in such conditions. "Enough," Tom's voice cut through the medical discussion. "She's sick because we drove her out here to begin with. Don't pretend this isn't our fault." Clara's recovery was slow and complicated by setbacks that left her weak and dependent on the daily visits from Dr. Henderson. Tom Bradley took it upon himself to coordinate her care, bringing proper food and medicine, organizing a rotation of townswomen to check on her, and gradually revealing the changes that had been taking place in Copper Ridge during her months of exile. "People have been talking," he explained one afternoon as Clara sat propped against blankets near the fire. "Not the kind of talking that happened before, but different, better. There's been some hard questions asked about how we treated you." It seemed that Samuel Pierce's arrest had indeed changed things, though not in the way Clara had expected. Rather than simply vindicating her, the news of his criminal activities had forced the townspeople to confront their own role in her downfall. A few of the braver women had begun to speak up,
questioning the justice of punishing Clara for being the victim of a predator. The conversation had been slow to spread, hampered by pride and the human tendency to avoid admitting wrongdoing, but it had been growing steadily. Martha Henley came to see me last week, Tom continued. She wanted to know if there was a way to reach out to you, to let you know that some of us have been wrong about everything. Clara listened to this news with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated, grateful that her innocence was finally being recognized. But another part, the part that had been hardened by months of rejection and cruelty, wondered why it had taken a criminal's arrest for them to see what should have been obvious from the beginning. Where does that leave me? She asked. Am I supposed to just forget everything that happened, pretend the last year never occurred?
Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression that reminded Clara of James. I don't know, he admitted. I don't think anyone expects you to forget, but maybe there's a way forward that doesn't require forgetting. Maybe there's a way to heal what's been broken. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, and Clara's heart leaped as she recognized the distinctive gait of James's horse. But when the rider appeared in the doorway, Clara's joy turned to concern. James looked haggard, older somehow, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of exhaustion beyond the physical. Tom excused himself quickly, sensing the need for privacy, but not before whispering to Clara, "Think about what I said. The door's opening, if you want to walk through it." James dismounted slowly, favoring his left side in a way that made Clara's trained eye catch on potential injury or illness. When he turned to face her, she saw immediately that something was wrong. His skin had a grayish pallor, and there were lines of pain around his eyes that hadn't been there when he left. "You're sick," Clara said, struggling to rise from her makeshift bed. "James, what's wrong?" "It's nothing," he said, but his voice lacked its usual strength. "I heard you were ill, came as soon as I could." Clara watched him move around the stable, noting the careful way he avoided sudden movements, the hand he kept pressed to his chest. The gesture she had noticed before now seemed obviously protective, and a terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. "How long?" she asked quietly. James stopped his busy work and looked at her with surprise. "How long what? How long have you been dying?" The words hung in the air between them like a death knell. James's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had finally become too much to bear, and Clara knew with certainty that her worst fears were true. "The doctor thinks maybe 6 months, he said finally. "Could be longer, could be shorter. My heart's giving out, has been for a while now." Clara felt the world tilt around her as the implications sank in. All those months of patient kindness, of gentle courtship, of building something beautiful together, he had known he was dying. Every tender moment, every passionate kiss, every whispered promise had been offered with the knowledge that their time was limited. "You knew," she whispered, anger and heartbreak warring in her voice. "All this time you knew you were going to leave me." James moved to her side, reaching for her hands, but Clara pulled away. The betrayal cut deeper than Samuel Pierce's abandonment because this felt like something sacred being profaned. She had given James her heart, her trust, her body, and he had accepted it all while keeping the most important truth to himself. "I wanted to tell you," he said, his voice breaking. "God knows I wanted to. But I was selfish, Clara. I was dying, and you made me feel alive again. I couldn't bear to watch that light in your eyes die before I did. So you thought you'd just disappear one day, and leave me wondering what happened. Let me think you'd abandon me like everyone else." "No." James's voice carried a conviction that made Clara look at him despite her anger. "I came back to tell you everything, to give you the choice I should have given you from the beginning." What James revealed over the next hour changed everything. Clara thought she knew about their relationship. He had not been wandering aimlessly when he first found her. He had been searching for her specifically, following rumors and stories that had spread beyond Copper Ridge about the schoolteacher who had been cast out for bearing a child out of wedlock. "I knew your parents," he said, his words falling into the fire-lit silence like stones into still water. "Your father and I served together in the war. He saved my life at Gettysburg, took a bullet meant for me. I promised him if anything ever happened, I'd look after his family." Clara stared at him in shock. Her father had died when she was 19, killed in a farming accident that had left her mother devastated and alone. She remembered him talking about his war service, about the friends he had made and lost. but James's name had never come up in those stories. He spoke of you often, James continued. His brilliant daughter who was going to be a teacher, who was going to make something of herself. When Sarah and I lost our son, your father's letters about you were one of the few things that gave me hope for the future. He was so proud of you, Clara, so proud of what you were becoming. The revelation that James had known her father, that he had come looking for her out of loyalty to a dead friend, recontextured everything about their relationship. Had his kindness been nothing more than obligation? Had his love been real, or simply the fulfillment of a deathbed promise? When I heard what had happened to you, James said, his voice rough with emotion,
Yo.
I knew I had to find you. I'd failed your father's memory by not being there when you needed help, but I thought maybe I could still make things right. I never expected to fall in love with me, Clara finished, her anger beginning to transform into something more complex. To find someone who could make me forget about dying, James corrected. To discover that even with time running out, there was still room in my heart for happiness. Clara sat in silence, processing revelations that changed everything and nothing. James had loved her. She could see that truth, written in every line of his face, feel it in the way he had touched her, hear it in the way he spoke her name. But he had also deceived her, keeping secrets that robbed her of the chance to make informed choices about her own heart. What happens now? She asked finally. James reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, placing it carefully in her hands. I've arranged for you to have choices, he said. There's enough money here to go anywhere you want, to start over completely. There's also a deed to a small house in Cedar Falls, and letters of introduction to people who can help you find work teaching again. Clara opened the portfolio with trembling hands, seeing documents that represented freedom and security beyond anything she had dared to imagine. There was also a sealed letter addressed to her in James's careful handwriting. And if I choose to stay here, she asked, to try to rebuild my life in Copper Ridge, then I'll stay with you for as long as I can, James said simply. However long that is. The decision Clara faced was unlike any she had ever confronted. James's revelation about his connection to her father had reframed their entire relationship, but it hadn't diminished the love she felt for him. If anything, knowing that he had sought her out initially from loyalty to her father's memory,
Oof.
made his growing affection feel more precious, not less. Over the following days, as James's condition visibly worsened despite his attempts to hide it, Clara found herself torn between competing desires. Part of her wanted to punish him for his deception, to withdraw her affection as payment for the pain his secrets had caused. But a larger part recognized that his time was limited, and that anger was a luxury neither of them could afford. The townspeople of Copper Ridge continued their tentative overtures of reconciliation.
Yeah.
With Tom Bradley serving as an unofficial ambassador, Martha Henley came personally to the stable, tears streaming down her face as she begged Clara's forgiveness for her role in the persecution. Other women followed, some genuinely repentant, others clearly motivated more by social pressure than personal conviction. They want their guilt absolved, Clara observed to James one evening, as they sat by the fire. They want me to forgive them so they can go back to feeling good about themselves. Does it matter what they want? James asked. What do you need? It was a question that cut to the heart of everything Clara had been struggling with. What did she need? Justice felt hollow when it came too late to prevent the suffering. Revenge seemed pointless when directed at people who were finally trying to do better. What she needed, Clara realized, was to find a way to move forward that honored both her pain and her hopes. The answer came to her gradually, shaped by long conversations with James and quiet reflection during the hours when he slept fitfully beside the fire. She would return to Copper Ridge, but not as the same woman who had been driven out. She would return as someone who had survived exile and abandonment, who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances, and who understood that forgiveness was something she gave herself as much as others. 3 weeks before the first snows were expected, Clara and James were married in a simple ceremony at the stable, with Tom Bradley serving as witness and Dr. Henderson presiding as a legally appointed justice of the peace. Clara wore a dress that the women of Copper Ridge had sewn for her as a gesture of reconciliation, not the elaborate gown she had once dreamed of, but something beautiful nonetheless. James was barely strong enough to stand for the brief ceremony. His breathing labored and his color poor, but his eyes were bright with happiness as he spoke his vows. They promised to love and cherish each other for as long as they both should live, words that carried extra weight given the knowledge of how little time they had left. The wedding was small but not entirely private. Word had spread through Copper Ridge, and a surprising number of townspeople made the journey to the abandoned stable to witness the ceremony. Some came out of genuine affection for Clara, others out of curiosity or guilt, but their presence transformed what could have been a somber affair into something approaching celebration. After the ceremony, as the guests shared simple refreshments and offered their congratulations, Clara found herself standing at the threshold between her old life and whatever came next. The stable that had been her refuge in prison was now the site of her wedding, transformed by love and community into something sacred. The winter that followed was both the happiest and most heartbreaking of Clara's life. James's condition deteriorated steadily, but his decline was punctuated by moments of startling clarity and joy that made each day precious beyond measure. They had moved from the stable to a small house in town that the community had prepared for them, a gesture of reconciliation that spoke louder than any words of apology. Clara found herself welcomed back into Copper Ridge society with a mixture of genuine warmth and residual awkwardness. Some people embraced her return wholeheartedly, while others maintained a polite distance that spoke of lingering discomfort with their own past behavior. Clara navigated these social complexities with grace born of hard experience, accepting genuine overtures of friendship while refusing to pretend that the past could be entirely erased. She began teaching again, initially tutoring individual children in their homes before gradually being invited to take on larger groups. The official school board remained hesitant to offer her a formal position. Too many members still harbored reservations about her past, but Clara found satisfaction in the work regardless of its unofficial status. The children, at least, seemed unaffected by the adult prejudices that had shaped their parents' reactions to her return. James spent his remaining energy helping Clara establish herself in the community, using his skills as a craftsman to repair and improve their small home. He worked slowly but steadily, as if each nail driven and board placed was an act of love made tangible. When his strength permitted, he would sit in Clara's classroom, watching with evident pride as she guided young minds through the mysteries of reading and arithmetic. On the good days, they would take short walks through town, James leaning heavily on Clara's arm but determined to maintain what dignity and independence he could. On the bad days he would lie in bed struggling for breath while Clara read to him from books they had collected, adventure stories, poetry, and the classics that had sustained her through her darkest times. As James's condition worsened through the deep winter months, their conversations took on an urgency and honesty that neither had experienced before. They spoke of fears and regrets, of dreams that would never be realized and hopes that had been fulfilled beyond expectation. It was during one of these late-night talks, as February winds howled around their small house, that James revealed the final piece of his story. "I need to tell you something about your father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "about the promise I made him." Clara had wondered about the details of that deathbed promise, but she had been afraid to ask, uncertain whether she wanted to know if James's love had been merely an obligation fulfilled. Now, seeing the urgency in his failing eyes, she steeled herself for whatever revelation was coming. "He didn't ask me to find you," James said, each word clearly difficult to speak. "He asked me to forgive myself for the friends I couldn't save, for the life I couldn't live after Sarah died. He said the greatest tragedy wasn't dying for your country, but surviving and then refusing to live." Clara felt her breath catch as the implications of this confession sank in. "Then why did you come looking for me?" James's smile was weak but genuine. "Because loving you taught me what your father meant. When I heard about your troubles, I realized that helping you might be the first step toward helping myself. I thought I was keeping a promise to a dead friend, but really I was learning to live again." The revelation recontextualized everything Clara thought she understood about their relationship. James hadn't sought her out from obligation. He had found her because they were both broken people who needed healing, both souls searching for redemption in a world that had shown them little mercy. "So you didn't love me because of my father," Clara said,
seeking confirmation of what her heart already knew. I loved you because you were you, James replied, brave and brilliant and beautiful, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise. Your father would have been proud of the woman you became, but my love for you had nothing to do with his memory and everything to do with your light. James died on a morning in early March, when the first crocuses were pushing through the last of the snow. Clara woke to find him still and peaceful beside her, his face relaxed in a way it hadn't been for weeks. The struggle that had defined his final months was over, leaving behind only the echo of his quiet strength and the memory of a love that had transformed them both. The funeral was attended by most of Copper Ridge, a testament to how completely the community had embraced James during their brief time together. He was buried in the town cemetery beside other husbands and fathers, his grave marked with a simple stone that identified him as beloved husband and friend. Clara stood at the graveside surrounded by people who had once shunned her, their presence a bittersweet reminder of how much had changed since that night when a stranger had appeared in her stable.
In the weeks that followed, Clara threw herself into her work with renewed purpose. The official teaching position that had been denied her was finally offered, the school board having exhausted their ability to ignore the community pressure for her reinstatement. She accepted the role with the understanding that she would teach not just reading and arithmetic, but lessons about compassion, second chances, and the courage required to admit when you've been wrong. The house she had shared with James felt impossibly empty at first, every corner holding memories that brought both joy and pain. But gradually, Clara began to fill the space with new purposes. She started a small library, using the books James had collected during his travels and donations from townspeople eager to support her work. She offered evening classes for adults who had never learned to read, and her home became a gathering place for women who needed support, guidance, or simply a safe space to share their troubles. 6 months after James's death, Clara discovered a letter he had hidden in their bedroom, tucked inside the Bible he had carried through all his travels. The envelope bore her name in his careful handwriting, along with instructions that it should be opened on the anniversary of their wedding day. Clara held the letter for a long time before breaking the seal, knowing that it would contain his final words to her, his last gift of love and guidance.
Asterisk.
My dearest Clara, asterisk.
E.
If you are reading this, then I have gone ahead to whatever comes next, and you are faced with the question of what to do with the life we built together. I hope you will forgive me for one final presumption, in offering advice you may not need or want. Asterisk. Asterisk. Do not let my death be an excuse to retreat from the world again. You have fought too hard to reclaim your place in this community to surrender it now. The children need you. The women who look to you for strength need you.
E.
And most of all, you need the purpose that teaching gives you. Asterisk.
O.
Asterisk.
O.
I know there will be days when the loneliness feels unbearable, when you wonder if the love we shared was worth the pain of losing it. On those days, remember that love is not diminished by death, it is made eternal by it. What we had together will always be part of who you are, just as your love has become part of who I was. Asterisk. You asked me once why I helped you that first night in the stable.
E.
Why a stranger would chop wood for someone he didn't know. The truth is, I recognized something in you that night, the same stubborn refusal to surrender that I had lost, but needed to find again. You taught me that surviving isn't enough. You have to insist on living, even when the world tries to convince you that you don't deserve to ask.
E.
Clara, love again if you find someone worthy of your heart. Teach those children to be better than their parents. Show this community what forgiveness looks like in practice, not just in theory. And when people ask you how you found the strength to keep going, tell them it came from the same place all strength comes from, the decision to get up each morning and try again.
E.
Asterisk. I will be waiting for you however long it takes, and wherever we meet again. Until then, you carry my love with you, just as I carried yours with me when I left.
E.
Asterisk. Forever yours. Asterisk.
E.
James asterisk. Clara kept James's letter close to her heart, as she built a new life from the foundation of love and loss they had created together. The school flourished under her guidance, becoming known throughout the territory for the quality of education it provided, and the innovative methods Clara employed. She corresponded with educators in distant cities, sharing ideas and constantly improving her techniques. The library she had started in her home grew into a proper community institution, housed in a building donated by Tom Bradley and funded through donations from across the territory. Clara served as its first librarian, while continuing her teaching duties, creating a center of learning that drew visitors from hundreds of miles away. As the years passed, Clara received several proposals of marriage from good men who appreciated her intelligence and strength. She considered each offer carefully, but ultimately declined them all, not from inability to love again, but from a deep contentment with the life she had built. James's love had taught her that she was complete in herself, that she didn't need another person to validate her worth or provide her with purpose. She never forgot the lesson of that first night in the stable, when a stranger had appeared in her darkest hour, not to save her, but to remind her that she was worth saving. In turn, she became that presence for others, the teacher who saw potential in difficult students, the friend who offered support without judgment, the community leader who advocated for those who couldn't advocate for themselves. 20 years after James's death, Clara stood before a classroom filled with the children and grandchildren of people who had once shunned her. At 65, her hair was silver, and her face lined with years of laughter and sorrow, but her eyes still held the fire that had sustained her through exile and loss. On this particular day, she was teaching a lesson about courage, not the kind found in battles and adventures, but the quiet courage required for daily living. She spoke of second chances, and the importance of seeing beyond surface judgments, of the strength that comes from admitting mistakes, and the grace required to forgive them. True love, she told her students, isn't just what happens between a man and a woman. It's what happens when we choose to see the best in each other, when we offer help without expecting anything in return, when we refuse to let someone else's past define their future. After class, as Clara was organizing her materials, one of her older students approached with a question that made her smile. "Miss Clara," the girl said, using the title Clara had maintained even after her marriage, "do you think that stranger would have stopped to help you if he had known you were going to fall in love?" Clara considered the question seriously, as she did all inquiries from her students. "I think," she said finally, "that love was never the point. Kindness was the point. Love was just the beautiful surprise that grew from it." In her final years, Clara often returned to the old stable, where her new life had begun. The structure had been maintained as a kind of informal monument, though to what exactly, the townspeople weren't entirely sure. Some said it honored Clara's resilience. Others claimed it commemorated James's sacrifice, but Clara knew the truth was simpler and more complex than either explanation. The stable represented the moment when two broken people had chosen to see each other as human beings worthy of kindness and respect. It embodied the radical idea that love could grow in the most unlikely places, between the most unlikely people, under the most impossible circumstances. On her 71st birthday, Clara made her final visit to the stable. She was accompanied by 3 generations of former students, people whose lives had been shaped by her teaching and example. They found her there the next morning, sitting peacefully by the cold ashes of countless fires, a letter in her lap addressed to the people of Copper Ridge. The letter, read aloud at her funeral by Tom Bradley's grandson, contained Clara's final message to the community that had rejected and then embraced her vote.
Love
Is not something we fall into by accident or deserve through good behavior. Love is something we choose to practice, again and again, until it becomes as natural as breathing. The stranger who helped me that first night chose love over indifference. I chose love over bitterness. You chose love over fear. These choices, made by imperfect people in imperfect circumstances, created something beautiful from something broken.
always.
Remember this when you face your own storms, your own moments of exile and despair. Remember that love transcends all boundaries, of time and death, of shame and fear, of difference and distance. And remember that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion or romance, but with a simple act of kindness offered by one human being to another. Note, the fire always burns, if we choose to tend it. Clara Whitmore was buried beside James in the Copper Ridge Cemetery, their graves marked with matching stones that bore the same inscription. They chose love. The stable where their story began still stands, maintained now by the town, as a reminder that redemption is always possible, that love can indeed transcend all boundaries, and that sometimes the most profound act of courage is simply refusing to give up on the possibility of tomorrow. In the end,
Clara's life became proof of the truth she had discovered in her darkest hour, that love is not a feeling we wait to receive, but a choice we make each day to see the light in others and tend the fire of hope in ourselves. Her story, passed down through generations of students and townspeople, serves as an enduring testament to the transformative power of kindness, the necessity of second chances, and the magnificent truth that love once kindled burns eternal.